Welcome everyone to the globalsanctions.co.uk webinar. Some of you may have noticed a renaming from European sanctions to global sanctions. We've got more international coverage, so I'm delighted to welcome everyone to our new webinar. All of you will be used to the fact that sanctions are an extremely complex, overlapping, sometimes inconsistent web of different legal restrictions. We've all got very used to addressing that and discussing it in the context of Russia. So it's refreshing in a way and depressing in another to switch to another area of serious concern in the world where sanctions have a very major and complicated impact, namely Gaza and the situation there at the moment. We are here today with some really wonderful panelists to discuss the tricky topic of routing payments to Gaza. Are they happening? How are they happening? What are the legal restrictions? How is that operating, if at all? And we do so in a context where obviously the issue of payments in that part of the world couldn't be more important, but also against the backdrop of fierce discussion more generally about debanking, de-risking jurisdictions where making payments for financial institutions, for charities, NGOs, and others is extremely complex. So briefly to introduce the panelists today, I'm extremely delighted to welcome Chloe Sina, who will be known to many of you, who's an international sanctions expert with many different banking and other jobs under her belt, including in the British government for a while. Luma Zitani, who is the Director of Risk and Compliance at Accenture. Welcome, Luma. We also have Erica Moray, who is the Policy Director at Polysync and Senior Researcher for Sanctions and Sustainable Peace Hub at the Geneva Graduate Institute. And we also have Sophie Huvet, who is the Restrictive Measures Sanctions Regional Advisory at the ICRC. They may want to introduce a bit more about what they do when they are talking on the panel. We also just wanted to make clear, of course, that they're not giving legal advice in this webinar. They are discussing the tricky issues that arise. We will make this available in a recording afterwards. And we very much hope to make this a discussion with anyone and everyone who's listening. So please do ask questions whenever you like by tapping them into the Q&A box, which you should have on your screens. So moving into the substance of this, I should say we're going to be a maximum of an hour, including questions and answers. So we're going to try and keep the pace moving and interesting for everyone. I wanted to start with Sophie. If you wanted to introduce a bit more about what you do, what ICRC does, I think that would be helpful. But could you just start, when you do so, by setting out the scene of the existing regulatory and legal framework? So basically, what sanctions and other regulations are we talking about? And maybe say a bit about how aid agencies have managed, if they have managed, to deliver aid to Gaza within this framework, not just now, but obviously over the past 10 years or so. Sophie, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Maya, and thank you for having me on the panel. I just want to start by emphasizing that in Gaza at the moment, we're in a situation of armed conflict where the civilian needs are incredibly high, and in front of that, we also face incredibly difficult conditions for humanitarian access. So there is a really crucial need of preserving the humanitarian space there, and sanctions, counterterrorism sanctions, so city sanctions as we call them, and other city frameworks do impede our humanitarian access, and so it's important to focus on them today. In particular, because in Gaza, as you know, the Hamas is controlling territory. There are other groups like the Islamic Jihad also operating there, and the Hamas and Islamic Jihad are listed in many counterterrorism sanctions framework. So, for instance, at the US level, but also at the EU and UK level, these are the three contexts in which we focus usually more. At the US level, it means that any dealings with the listed entities, such as the Hamas, is completely prohibited by the sanctions. At the EU and UK level, any provision of resources, whether economic or financial, is also completely prohibited by the sanctions framework. So you have this US, EU, UK, but you also have other countries which have imposed other sets of sanctions, such as Australia, Canada. You also have to look at the Israeli legislation. And on top of sanctions regimes, you have counterterrorism criminal legislation. So other bits of domestic legislation that prohibits terrorism financing and so on and so forth.
And Sophie, how does that, just before you go on,
Sure.
so when you're dealing with an area like Gaza, you know, under Hamas control, as it were, and Hamas themselves are, you know, designated as a terrorist organization under counterterrorism legislation around the world, what in particular does that mean? I mean, how are you in the business of trying to work out what exactly Gaza Hamas controls and doesn't control? What does it mean for your operations in practice?
Thank you, Maya. I was just getting to that. Like, how does it actually implicate or relates to our activities? Well, you know, the ICRC is an impartial, neutral humanitarian actors, and so we strive to provide aid to all the people who need it in situation of armed conflict. And sometimes it means that we have to work with government or non-government groups that control territory. In what sense? In Gaza, we've been present for 60 years or so, so for a very long time, and we have conducted a wide range of activities there. Such as medical activities, for instance, in support of existing health structures, so in support of hospitals, of maternities, but these health structures are under the de facto control of Hamas political authorities. So when we provide medicine or medical equipment or generators or fuel for the hospitals to actually work, under a very strict legal reading, we do provide them, or we work with the listed entity. The end beneficiaries are the sick people, are the wounded and sick in the hospitals. They're the mothers, you know, and the children. But under a strict legal reading, you could see that it contravenes. It could be read as a contradiction to sanctions framework. Another example is that we deliver assistance, so material assistance to detainees in Hamas detaining places in Gaza. So this assistance to detainees is conducted we have to work with the prison authorities, which are also under Hamas control. So these are examples of how our impartial, neutral humanitarian activities could be perceived as violating sanctions frameworks. And I just want to emphasize on that we do have very strong due diligence procedures to ensure that the aid reaches only the beneficiaries, so only the people who are in actual need of help, and does not benefit the Hamas. And I also want to add on that Gaza in and of itself is not a context that is prone to aid diversion. So strong procedure, strong due diligence policies, and also a context not prone to aid diversion. But I understand that this, you know, the very strict legal frameworks, very strict legal reading can also be discouraging for banks, for our private sector partners, because I do understand some reluctance in engaging in financial transaction when you hear that the financial transaction to facilitate humanitarian activity may actually, violate CT sanctions framework. So I understand the risks there. And I also just want to say that the legal framework that is applicable in Gaza, the CT sanctions framework, the city criminal laws, it's been the same for the past 10 or 20 years. The Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, they have been listed for 10 or 20 years at the US level, at the EU level, at the UK level. So the legal risk and the legal framework have been the same. And the crisis that started on October 7 has not changed the legal framework, but it has reshaped the way that this legal framework is interpreted and perceived by the private sector and also by donors. And so the risk appetite has actually decreased. And we've faced some de-risking cases, us as the ICRC, but also we know that other NGOs operating under EU jurisdiction have faced de-risking cases by EU banks. And we faced also difficulties to conclude funding agreements with some donors. So all in all is, we see an increased expression of supports from banks, from states, from donors, to facilitate the humanitarian access in Gaza. But on the other hand, we also face increased concerns that translate into de-risking practices and overcompliance, and all complexifies our access there.
Okay, that's incredibly helpful introduction. Thank you so much. Just, I suppose, before we move on to others. Could I ask, I mean, do you engage, I'm assuming when you're providing aid to Gaza, there is some engagement with governments over issues like, you know, is this breaching counterterrorism legislation? And I know obviously some governments have been putting in place humanitarian provisions and exemptions to try to make the delivery of aid lawful and I guess easier. So, I mean, are there, before we move on, what sort of humanitarian exemptions, general licenses are in place in relation to Gaza? And are there additional things that you think could be done by governments and groups of governments to help the situation?
Sure, thank you. Well, just first let me say that the delivery of aid, of impartial humanitarian aid, is always lawful under IHL when it's conducted by impartial humanitarian actors, right? We don't wait for sanctions to give us permissions to act. But having a humanitarian carve-out, so an exemption or a general license that specifies that this activity will not be read as contravening sanctions framework is helpful in terms of legal risk in a domestic framework, but also in terms of interactions and reassuring the private sectors and our partners, so our banks and our suppliers. We do have context in which we have some humanitarian provisions. So the US already had adopted general licenses that are very helpful because they were already there when the crisis started. So there was no time for uncertainty. You know, we already knew that there was legal clarity that allowed our banks and suppliers in the US to operate with us. The UK just also adopted recently, a month ago or so, a general license that is applicable to Israel and occupied territories to allow us to facilitate our humanitarian activities. But there are also contexts in which we do not have that type of provision, so at the EU level, notably, and it's something that we insist on. In terms of changes, well, I mean, it's one thing to have carve-outs, and it's extremely important to have them. It's another to ensure that they have an impact. And on that, we really insist that policymakers should do an outreach to the private sector, doing two things. The first one is that they need to emphasize that the humanitarian exemption or that the general license exists, because banks may not always, you know, refresh their web pages to see if something has been adopted. And the second one is to explain what sanctions mean so that the private sector feels confident in how they interpret the sanctions framework, but also the humanitarian carve-out. And just to give you an example, the US Treasury recently, when the crisis started, the first thing that OFAC or the US Treasury did was to remind people that the US had adopted general license to facilitate humanitarian activities. Second, they issued a compliance communique to explain the framework and to provide some Q&A to facilitate understanding the humanitarian carve-out. And then third, they released public statements to reinforce how the general license could be perceived and to reassure the private sector. So these are concrete steps that can be done by the policymakers.
Okay, thank you so much. Luma, can I just open this up to you just on what Sophie has already covered? Do you want to come in and comment from your perspective at Essentia?
No, sure. And just a quick caveat. So I am speaking in a personal capacity rather than on behalf of Accenture. I am part of our global compliance and risk practice with specific focus on financial crime. But as similar to Chloe and some of the participants, I've been operating within the sanction space for the last 15 plus years. I think building on what Sophie has said, a huge part of the complexity comes from how the sanctions and counterterrorism regimes are constructed, where you have not a single framework that has everything nicely listed, but an overlay of regulations, provision, executive orders. Some have clear open carve-out for humanitarian activities, some requiring more specific licenses depending on the regime and the situation and the participant. Interestingly, as Sophie has said, Gaza and the occupied territories are not subject to comprehensive sanctions, for example, under the US, which basically does not put that blanket ban on all activities within the territory. But there is a heavy flux in terms of the counterterrorism activities, as well as specific restrictions targeting the operations, the military arms operating within that region. I think from a practicality point of view, what has become very challenging is that we're now having a little bit of a confluence between over interpretation of the regulations being also attached with a reputational risk approach and a do risk which is driving massive de-risking. So you end up with over interpretation of the restrictions that, as Sophie has articulated, haven't changed, in order to stop doing certain activity which have still continued to be legally permissible. Of course, this is further compounded by the actual practical challenges on the ground, whereby we're talking about a complete collapse of the banking sector, complete collapse of channels that normally the ICRC and other recognizable charities who have had large programs in the region for many years now don't have those established routes. Having to compensate, that's creating itself additional complexity, because you now need to identify how safe and secure and compliant ways to deliver aid, whether monetary or physical, in a very high flux situation. And I think that's part of the challenge that we face today.
Chloe, can I just ask you to come in and say something about this topic from the perspective of someone who's worked a lot in financial institutions, trying to deal with the enormously difficult questions, I suppose, about de-risking, risk appetite, and aid delivery. Can I open up to you?
Of course. Thanks, Maya. And just like Luma, I want to state at the outset that I am speaking in my personal capacity here. It is quite a sensitive topic, as you can imagine. So I think it's been really helpful for Sophie to set out the regulatory and legal framework here in terms of sanctions and counterterrorism legislation. I think the point has been very well made and asserted by Sophie, which is that this isn't new. We've been operating within this legal and regulatory framework for the best part of 10 to 15 years. And Hamas has been designated, along with a number of other organizations, prescribed as a terrorist organization by different jurisdictions. And so for those banks that have had relationships, whether it's directly into the West Bank or Gaza, with some of the Arab banks operating there, or the Palestinian banks operating there, or indeed with correspondent relationships in the region in jurisdictions such as Jordan or Egypt or Lebanon, this legal and regulatory framework has existed for some time. So navigating a bank's way through those different and very complex layers of legislation isn't new. I think what has changed is, of course, the political perception and also the sentiment on the ground as to what can be done and what should be done within that framework. And I think this is where we're seeing a real crisis, because what we have seen on the ground over the past 2 and a bit months, so since the 7th of October, is a humanitarian relief effort which has been severely impeded. And it's not just access to funds, of course, it's much broader than that. And what we're seeing now is a cash-dependent economy that has basically collapsed. And I'm not sure if everybody on the call is aware of this, but only 2 days ago, I think, Erica, you pointed this out, we saw a ton of cash. I think it was in the region of around about $50 million being transported from the north of Gaza to the south of Gaza to those ATMs, I believe only 6 ATMs, which are still in operation in safe parts of Gaza, in order to relieve some of that pressure on what has always been, certainly since 1967, a cash-dependent economy. What we're seeing in terms of the banking side is a real disruption in the region. It's not just the inability to be able to get funds into Gaza or into the West Bank, and that being impeded by general risk appetite. And of course, banks can de-risk if they wish to. But for those banks also operating outside of Gaza and the West Bank, we've seen a real restriction and delay in those sorts of payments that we would otherwise have seen going into countries like Jordan or Lebanon.
And Chloe, just before we pass around to the others, I mean, for those who don't know on the webinar, I mean, are they may be surprised to know that international banks were operating at all in Gaza. I mean, what is the position on debanking? We'll talk a bit about sort of alternative permissible payment channels, but, you know, is there a functioning banking system? Has the world of international finance completely retreated? How is that working in practice now?
I think it's an excellent question, Maya. I'm no expert on this. I think from the 1990s onwards, we've seen a huge amount of technical and developmental support from the World Bank and from the IMF, providing that sort of stability and assistance that has been required in order to prop up the banking system in Gaza and in the West Bank. I think today there is very little that is operating. There are a number of reasons. One can put in things like the fact that the critical infrastructure has been dismantled. There's absolutely no access in certain parts of Gaza to electricity, which of course is required for the banking operations to function. I think in terms of international banks presence, there has not been any Western financial institutions in operation in Gaza or West Bank at all. That's not new. There have been, of course, Arab banks that have had those relationships, both in the commercial and in the private banking sector. But again, the banking sector has pretty much collapsed in Gaza. And as I explained earlier, there is really very little going on apart from in those parts of the south where there are a few operating ATMs. So in terms of getting money in, it has to be through the region. And what we've seen, and I've spoken to a couple of other banks on this, is that even that is a situation which is unfolding and collapsing as we speak. We're seeing delays, we're seeing returns of payments. And so even the regional context here is having a ripple effect as a result of what's going on in Gaza.
Okay, that's all incredibly helpful. I wanted to bring in Erica. Erica, I mean, you've done a lot of fascinating work in other jurisdictions over the years. So just to think perhaps a bit comparatively, I mean, are there lessons, comparisons from countries like Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, where obviously financial sector de-risking and what is sometimes called sort of over-compliance with sanctions, but sort of withdrawal, have obviously been very tricky in terms of the humanitarian response. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Maya, and thanks also for having me here today to discuss this very important topic. So from my side, I've worked on sanctions for around 20 years now, and for the last 10 years, I've worked a lot with the likes of the UN, EU, Swiss government, US government, and so on, particularly to think about how this de-risking issue can be tackled, how some of the knock-on effects of sanctions and other regulations can be minimized. We recently concluded a de-risking series that was funded by the EU and Swiss government, for example. So I'd like to share some of these findings from other jurisdictions with you today, because I think there's a lot we can learn from what has happened elsewhere and what is happening elsewhere in the world. So to take a step back, just to say that this problem of de-risking that Chloe was talking about, you know, the withdrawal of financial institutions from certain jurisdictions, is a growing problem around the world. We're seeing a mounting number of countries that are becoming severely, if not completely, disconnected from the international financial system. Some of them were never particularly integrated anyway, but we're seeing a growing number of countries that really struggle to access any banking channels whatsoever. And there are, of course, many drivers for this. Chloe already alluded to some of them, but it's in part due to this very complex international compliance landscape that makes it very difficult for banks to navigate. There's the burden of carrying out due diligence and so on. There are the costs associated with it, and there's also the reputational considerations. So there are numerous drivers. The problem has been described as such a grave one that the likes of the IMF, World Bank, Financial Action Task Force, the G20 have all described this problem as a global crisis that warrants urgent action. The problem of de-risking that we see in countries such as Syria, that you already mentioned, Afghanistan and so on, cause severe barriers to humanitarian organizations and other NGOs. One major NGO this year described payment challenges as the #1 threat to humanitarian assistance today. So that demonstrates the really important role that payments have to play in this area. It can also impact on global trade. And that's to say impacts of supply chains, whether it's essential goods, medicines, food, water, fuel, and so on. And in some research we did at the Graduate Institute over the last 3 years, we found examples of over-compliance and de-risking across the full supply chains that can be involved in essential goods. And it can also impede normal economic activities. And what we see in cases like Afghanistan is it's absolutely vital that there is a resumption of trade, normal economic activities, because a country cannot depend only on humanitarian and development sectors. The final area that we see de-risking having a really negative impact is on vulnerable communities. The entirety of Gaza is, of course, now considered to be in critical need of humanitarian assistance. We're talking about a very large population. Remittances can be impeded because when you can't access financial flows, this can become a serious concern, and financial exclusion is a kind of end result. And we really don't want this to happen if we're thinking about questions of global peace and security, because financial exclusion, we know from many cases around the world, can serve as a driver for new conflicts, for violent extremism, for extremist ideologies, for human rights abuses like human trafficking and modern slavery, also gender inequality and so on. So it's absolutely vital that this kind of vicious circle that can ensue is cut and addressed. There are many initiatives around the world seeking to tackle this problem. There is a huge amount of work that's being done behind the scenes across sectors, in governments, in the EU, in the US, within the EUN, also in the banking sector, within the NGO world, and so on. Incredible dedication to getting this sorted. But what I think is needed here is a kind of consolidated approach. First of all, to draw lessons from elsewhere and to recognize that full-blown isolation can be very detrimental. Thinking more about policy change, innovation, and so on, what's worked elsewhere and so on. But also a recognition that it's not enough for one actor to be tackling this alone, and that a mapping exercise really of the very rapidly changing situation on the ground is going to be needed, and it will need to be updated regularly, because we're looking at a situation now where there are probably very limited options using banks. So we need to be thinking about what other permissible payment channels are out there, like Maya mentioned already, and keep an updated view of that in order to support humanitarian assistance and economic activities, remittances, and so on.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. I'm going to sort of weave into my questions some of the very interesting questions we're being asked about. Sophie, I wanted to ask you a couple of things. I suppose, first of all, from the point of view of the International Red Cross, so from the point of view of humanitarian organizations operating in Gaza, can you say a bit about the payment challenges, but also what measures, how in practice do you try to ensure as much as possible that aid doesn't, as it were, fall into the wrong hands, whatever that really means? I mean, we see a lot of reports about the challenges of fuel coming into the area, and just as a matter of practicality, how do you go about assessing those sorts of issues?
Right, thank you for the question. So two separate questions. The first one on payment challenges. Well, I can speak for ICRC experience, but I really cannot speak for the whole of the humanitarian community, obviously, although I can share some things that have been shared with me. Just as a disclaimer, as the ICRC, we kind of distinguish between de-risking and over-compliance. We generally see de-risking as a decision made by a bank to not operate because of the lack of an adequate framework, so a city sanctions framework without a humanitarian carve-out. Whereas for over-compliance is when we have an exemption, when we have a general license that is in place that would allow the bank to operate safely, and the bank still refuses to do so. But this is the ICRC distinction. In Gaza, we face a little bit of both. As I said before, we faced 2 or 3 cases of de-risking for ICRC financial transfers by a German intermediary bank. So we work with our own bank, Swiss bank, but we have to pass through intermediary banks at the EU level sometimes. And we faced a denial by this bank. And I know for a fact that 2 other major EU NGOs have faced de-risking cases for payment transfers to Gaza by the same bank. So it has been overcome. The challenge has been overcome, but that was a problem. And I also want to point out the fact that although the ICRC faces de-risking decisions and over-compliance decisions, Islamic charities are the ones that face the bulk of the de-risking decisions, faith-based organizations, but especially Islamic charities in that context. That being said, in terms of what do we do to prevent that aid falls into the wrong hands, we have very strong due diligence policies at the ICRC, but also in general for all impartial humanitarian actors operating in that context. At the ICRC, we directly implement our activities. So, from the moment that we import goods or that we buy goods for the benefit of civilians, and we conduct assistance activities, we directly implement them, or we directly supervise the implementation of activities. So it's always under ICRC monitoring. We also screen our contractors, our local suppliers, and so on and so forth against the many city sanctions lists that can exist. And I also want to point out the fact that every parcel of humanitarian aid that goes into Gaza has to be approved both by Hamas, but also by Israel. So everything that goes into Gaza is already approved by Israel. This is very complicated now since the October 7th, but it was that was the case way before the crisis, right? So to give you just an example, we provide generators for hospitals in Gaza. And on these generators, we put GPS trackers that cannot be removed. And the location of these GPS trackers is actually shared with the Israeli government. And this is agreed upon by Israel and by Hamas. So this is the type of measures that we put in place to ensure that the generator will not be diverted by the group. Another example is that we benefit from tax exemptions in Gaza. It means that we do not pay taxes to Hamas as a political authority or as a de facto controlling authorities, and our local suppliers also do not pay VAT. They benefit from a tax exemption when they contract with us. So there's no provision at all that benefits to the Hamas. And 3 weeks ago, I think the US Special Envoy was in Gaza and testified to the fact that he could not find any instance of aid diversion. And the EU recently said the same thing. So, voilà.
Okay, can we just move to the sort of payment channels that might be active in Gaza and really what we're talking about? Perhaps Luma first, if you want to come in on this. I mean, in Gaza, and for example, from your experience in Syria, if that's different, can you just explain a bit about possible payment channels that are actually active, as far as you know, in Gaza and to Gaza? I'm thinking, I mean, obviously banks, but money transfer operations, money value transfer systems, Hawala, tech-based payment platforms, and so on. We've been asked in particular, I mean, is it safe to provide money transfer services in Gaza? And I think Chloe mentioned a bit about Western Union exposure in Gaza. So perhaps Luma and then Chloe might come in on this issue.
That's fine. So I think when we were discussing this briefly ahead of the session, at the moment, I think the actual movement of cash and monetary instruments into the territory is pretty much non-existent. What is flowing in is physical aid through the borders. Previously, so there was an element of a operating banking system. There were some banks that had operation in West Bank that had also had presence in Gaza. And Sophie alluded to that there was enough of a legal framework that and a regulatory framework that allowed for settlement of what needed to be paid in cash into those territories via those channels. But today, in today's world, considering the complete collapse of the economic situation, there's a bit of a question mark on actually physical cash or monetary cash getting there. What we are seeing, and again, in other jurisdictions, and I'm just throwing back into, for example, Syria, which is the closest one where we had a high conflict zone and need to deliver cash into areas which does not have any established even framework to allow for those channels to convert. Basically what you had is that you had a quasi Hawala-based system with funds flowing into neighboring country and then being passed on so the last mile was done physically over the border. Again, these were very complicated arrangements that needed to be approved with the full visibility of the regulatory authorities to allow those to happen, considering the high level of risk associated with these activities. Whether something like that might actually also be in place at the moment, I think in Gaza is another matter. What is an issue is that what we will see as part of that general de-risking is that the flow of those payments that are going to neighboring countries in order to facilitate, for example, local staff who have now need to up their contribution are getting impacted, and those are going through a normal established payment channel are getting impacted because of the broader de-risking that is being perceived. So the payment channels there that have been used are being compromised. Now, the problem that this causes is that de-risking activity have an adverse effect because it pushes legal activity to go underground. That's something that we need to always be mindful of, and it's basically the counterproductive result of de-risking that we can see.
Erica, did you want to say something on this topic?
Yeah, thanks. That's such an interesting question. So again, if I could draw from some other contexts, I think when we're looking at a situation like this, where there are multiple constraints in place, physical, security, logistical, political, and regulatory, you start to have to think about ad hoc solutions, possibly ones that will be temporary, to ensure that some form of funds can continue going into the country, out of the country, because ultimately people have to pay for things that come in as well, and circulate within the country. So that in itself is a massive challenge. Ideally, this would go through banks, of course, but what we see in other contexts is that NGOs, people engaging in trade, individuals and so on, may have to resort to other payment channels, and these will be legal, regulated, and sanctions compliant channels. So this could be the likes of money transfer operators, likes of Western Union or MoneyGram and so on. Whatever is remaining in Gaza, I don't know. I think we need to look into this, and this really warrants some urgent research. There could be financial service businesses, money service businesses, and so on. Hawala, as you mentioned, money and value transfer systems more generally have been used increasingly as a legitimate tool of last resort by a number of NGOs in certain contexts. And there are ways of making use of this modality in a way that is deemed to be compliant with sanctions and other legislation, and which various major banks and governments and donors and so on are happy with. So I think that's also a consideration if this is needed at the moment. We also should be thinking more about tech, the role of tech and innovation. There is so much happening on this front, particularly in Africa and in various other contexts. We actually have a forum for innovation in humanitarian payments, which we're launching literally in the next couple of weeks in Geneva, where we hope to be looking into this question on Gaza. But I think ultimately, there are also going to be a role to be played by public bodies. In Afghanistan, for example, we've seen bulk cash transfer. Last time I was involved in a count, which was back in May, it was $2.6 billion that had been shipped, trucked and flown into the country. We also see these quite elaborate money exchange mechanisms where one payment is made within the country and one is made outside. That might be between NGOs or businesses and so on. These are all coping mechanisms, but I think we will probably have to see a combination of all of these eventually happening in Gaza, and they will probably wax and wane depending on the constraints at play at the given time.
Okay, that's very helpful. Chloe, I wanted to come on to ask a bit about the position of smaller NGOs and charities, but before I do you want to comment on what's been said on Western Union alternative payment channels or anything else?
Absolutely. I think we've come a long way since 2011 and the Arab Spring, and where we saw severe restrictions, and we saw certain countries subject to and still subject to comprehensive sanctions. I think work that has been undertaken by the international community over the past, well, more than a decade now, has meant that we have become a little bit more confident and a little bit more forward-leaning when it comes to alternative banking channels, and trying to find safe banking channels which are in the context of alternative channels like those that have been discussed by Luma and Erica, like Hawala, is a system which I think most of us are familiar with, but perhaps 6 or 7 years ago were not prepared to accept that it was something that could be used as a safe banking channel. And I think what we've seen over the past 6 years is a huge amount of work in this direction, which has led to countries like Syria being able to rely on, especially in the context of very small NGOs working on the ground, where there are no traditional banking channels open, and only the system of Hawala is able to operate in certain parts of Syria. We've been more accepting of that, certainly in the West, even in the US, that this is something, certainly if we look at what happened after the earthquake in Syria in February this year, we saw a really broad general license 23, which was issued by OFAC, which essentially allowed for all sorts of payments which were critical to the disaster relief following that earthquake in Syria. So I think what's important here is to understand in Gaza, I mean, the situation is a very dynamic and evolving landscape. So from the 7th of October until now, we've seen, as Erica said, a number of ad hoc responses, which have meant that whilst the overall banking system has collapsed, inevitably there will be other ways that funds can and should be able to get into the country, but it's still very challenging at this juncture.
And Chloe, just before we leave you for now, is there anything more you think that governments can do to improve the situation? I mean, there have been licenses, general licenses relating to humanitarian work. Should there be something broader, more focused? Or do you think all that's been...
Absolutely. I really do think, Maya, there's more that can be done. I think it was very nicely set out by Sophie at the outset, and when it came to what the US has done. The US always leads and is, in some respects, the best example of how to put a message out there and how to encourage, albeit that if banks are going to de-risk, it's a matter for them based on their risk appetite as to what they will do. But the more information that is out there, the more confidence that the banking sector can gain from the actual needs that are on the ground, from the people that need to have access to this aid, the better it can be. Now, if we can see that same sort of messaging from the UK government and indeed the EU, which is aligned and giving these broadest exemptions in order to couch kind of some of the language that we see across the banking sector, which is we've got to withdraw, we shouldn't be involved in this, because balancing those very tricky risks between terrorist financing and the delivery of aid. I think the more consistent the messaging is and the more global that messaging is, the better it is for the aid agencies, but also for the banks that are financing them.
But I think so. The UK has issued a humanitarian general license relating to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, relating to the provision of humanitarian assistance and so on. So there are licenses and general licenses in place, but are you suggesting they could be broader, or there should be?
I think the general licenses are helpful, and we've seen that. I think it was about a month ago that we saw the UK general license issued. I think it's the actual messaging that needs to come out to encourage those banks that are in a position to be able to act as a correspondent or as an intermediary to facilitate transactions into the region, because as I said before, there aren't really transactions that are going directly into Gaza. So if we think about the big US banks that have, I think my understanding is, are now returning payments and not engaged necessarily in the sort of payments that we were seeing pre 7th of October. I think with more messaging from the government and I include the EU as well, because I think that's where we're lacking a little bit of this, would be better. It's not just the authorities themselves, it's actually the political statements that corroborate what is already given in the particular license and exemption carve-outs.
Right. And is there an issue, Sophie, I don't know if you or Luma or anyone on the panel want to address this, but is there an issue for smaller NGOs in relation to general licenses and exemptions? Because I think they sometimes, don't fall within the relevant definitions. So do you have any thoughts or advice for those smaller organizations about how they are still able to operate if they can't do so under the general licenses?
So I'll pick up first, and I think, Erica, you probably have a lot to add into this. The challenge is twofold. There's a smaller charity's ability to undertake the level of due diligence that will be required and expected when you're operating in conflict zone. We've seen that repeatedly, which result, for example, throughout Syria, where there was a plethora of smaller charities that were set up to support work there. But the second they started to have to put a framework to answer the due diligence questions that they needed to meet in order to be able to actually operate, transact, and even open a maintain bank account, it was just the cost was prohibitive. I think, and of course, then this is further compounded by a general perception within the banking sector around the inability of those charities to be able to operate safely. I think the advice is very much, there's a huge amount of work that, and a very active piece of work that the Charity Commission has been working on for years to help define what a good due diligence framework that charities could adopt in order to address and answer some of the key questions that they will have to have in place before they even start on their fundraising and charitable support activity. Because otherwise, especially for international aid flowing into conflict zone, meeting the threshold in order to be able to get the aid through is going to almost be prohibitively expensive for those. The other side of things, and it is unfortunate, is because the capability of the charities to build those frameworks in place is restricted by limited resources, and that's hence the piece of work to help them do that within the sector. They are open for abuse, and again, we've seen these things happen, and that's why I would say the advice is proceed with cautious, have a conversation with your bank, and be very realistic about your ability to put that due diligence, not at your donors, but also at your aid recipients in order to get there. And I think the workaround has always been working through one of the larger charities, or following activities through one of the larger charities, because they've already had the pre-work done. And that kind of helped them navigate that.
Okay, Erica, could I bring you in on these issues, please?
Yeah, thank you. Well, excellent points from Luma. So I would just maybe make a few more conclusions to build on what you've said already, which is absolutely exemptions where they aren't already in place are absolutely vital, but also ensuring that the scope of activities and actors is fine-tuned where possible and accompanied with clear guidance. And that, I think, should include these various different types of payment channels. So if we go back to the Hawala question, which I think will become a really big method of fund transfer, it will have to, most probably, given all these restrictions, then most governments around the world don't yet have clear guidance or regulations on this. Some are working on it, some have done it. I would also say, to avoid additional layers of compliance burdens for NGOs, to recognize that many of these NGOs have been working for over a decade with heavily vetted and recognized partners and suppliers and so on, and to engage with the NGOs to understand these very rigorous due diligence frameworks that they have in place. And also, I think we need to be careful with these diversion questions to build the evidence and really make considered calculations based on any evidence we have out there. But also to keep in mind many of these mechanisms that are in place. I would also come back to the point, the need to monitor the health of the various payment channels will be vital here, and to support them where necessary, and that will involve proactive efforts to reduce de-risking. In one example, in the work I did with Norwegian Refugee Council on Afghanistan, we engaged closely with the US government, and they went back to some of the banks that had been de-risking within the US and helped to re-establish a banking channel. So that kind of proactive engagement can be beneficial, and I think it could be needed. And to work together, I think it's absolutely vital with the big development bags across the sanctioning authorities, the donors. Something needs to bring everybody together to think about policy change and innovation, the role of tech for good here, and drawing on lessons from around the world.
Okay. One for Sophie, and then I'm going to give each panelist just a very quick chance to say anything that they feel they haven't had a chance to say, but we need to wrap up soon. But Sophie, could you say a bit more about how the ICRC and others avoid being exposed to the US material support statute when dealing with Hamas? So we've been asked about that, and obviously it's an important one. And also whether the US, while we're on the US, whether the US general licenses apply to exports or only transactions, because you know, it may be that there is a difference in the way that those two are treated. I mean, it also occurs to me listening that obviously there are very different considerations when we're talking about payments in Gaza and when we're talking about the delivery of physical aid. And obviously it's not just sanctions, but, you know, ways to physically to deliver aid to Gaza at the moment, which are problematic. But Sophie, do you want to comment on that and anything else before we wind up?
Sure, but my answer might disappoint you, because I'm coming really from the Brussels side of things, so I'm more of an EU UK expert than a US expert. Yeah. So I'm not really at liberty to speak about the material support status. Yes, and can you repeat the second bit of the question? Sorry.
Yes, so you may not want to comment on this. Was about the scope of US general licenses and whether they also apply to exports. But we can come on to the US side with other speakers. So feel free to just make any closing remarks that you want to before we pass around.
Of course. Well, just for the CT US material support status, we always advocate, whether in the US or other jurisdiction, for counterterrorism legislation to include humanitarian exemptions, with more or less success, but we try to do that. For the US general licenses, there are many general licenses. Some apply to trade, some does not, and some apply to export. I really can't speak about it, but I just wanted to seize this opportunity to touch on the issue of smaller NGOs, because for us, for the ICRC, one of our main messages is that it's essential to preserve the ecosystem of humanitarian organizations and small charities that operate in situation of armed conflict. And some humanitarian carve-outs, some general licenses are broader than others. And at the US level in particular, we as the ICRC, we benefit from an international organization general license that is quite easy for us to benefit from. But other NGOs, the bulk of the NGOs do not, and they benefit from an NGO general license, which requires a bit more of legal expertise to understand, I think, and to go through, and often these smaller NGOs do not necessarily benefit from that legal expertise. So I think it's important to keep track of who is excluded and of whether general licenses and humanitarian exemptions cover all of the NGOs that should be covered. And I just also want to say that, last year, Resolution 2664 was adopted at the US level. It was a very positive development. It was a landmark resolution that granted humanitarian exemptions across all UN financial sanctions for present and for the future. And it has had inspirational value at the US level, but also at the EU level and at the UK level. So these things takes time. I mean, it took us 10 or 20 years to actually have humanitarian exemptions in financial sanctions regimes. And now we need to continue the awareness raising to ensure that everybody that needs to deliver aid is actually covered.
Okay. Chloe, did you want to say anything you haven't already covered?
I'm glad that 2664 was mentioned. I think it's a brilliant Security Council resolution, really innovative, and it was exactly what was needed. It's a shame it took a little bit of time to be implemented in the EU, and this is what I mean about messaging and exemptions and all being sort of put together in an aligned way, because the less complexity, the faster we can get through some of these very restrictive measures. I think in terms of what I'd like to say to finish, there are still banks out there which have a strong moral core and are still prepared to continue to facilitate transactions within the region, perhaps not directly into Gaza. And what we need to think about is that there's nearly 2 million internally displaced people who are reliant on aid. And so for those smaller organizations that perhaps don't have the ability to be able to have the direct relationships that some of the major charities and international organizations like the ICRC have, there are banks which are prepared to work with them. They are there, and if so long as the due diligence is done and so long as the will is there, I think there are still those financial institutions which can help. I think one key aspect of that is the payment testing, which Erica has talked about. I think trying to understand how to route transactions and understand which correspondents or which intermediaries are asking for RFIs, are causing delays, or indeed returning payments is key to the success of making sure that funds do reach certain jurisdictions where they can cross the border into Gaza.
Okay, thank you. Very briefly, Luma, any final thoughts from you?
Building on what Chloe has said, I think this needs to be a two-pronged approach. The charities need to understand, big or small, need to understand what is it that they need to do and engage through the charity forums, through the larger ones that are out there, in order to understand how to build a compliant framework that can then facilitate their conversation with the bank, because that's going to be the key starting point. And then understanding from a bank's and a government side of view, and I know there's green shoots in that space, is to ensure that you continue to operate in a more inclusive way, so that you're not effectively descoping anything other than the top tier blue chip charities that have the ability to operate. I think sharing knowledge and sharing what good practice look like, as well as innovation that Erica has referenced, that will then help create a common framework and a common platform that will allow for the flow, will be critical. Gaza at the moment is an active war zone. Hopefully will end soon. I think some of those questions will need to be answered very quickly, because the amount of work after the guns go silent hopefully will be mountainous. And I don't think any delay will have a major impact on how any recovery efforts in that space.
Thank you. Erica, any closing remarks before I make a few myself?
Yeah, thank you. These are such excellent suggestions from everybody. So I would first of all highlight the role of tri-sector groups. Some countries have them, bringing together banks, NGOs, governments, and so on. They're absolutely vital, and we've seen them playing a really beneficial role with regard to the Syrian earthquake, for example. And I think here we may also benefit from some kind of overarching dialogue in Gaza that brings together the different groups and other relevant stakeholders, because we really need to keep this a kind of up-to-date discussion. I think also the governments imposing the sanctions and making use of exemptions should be engaging very closely with different stakeholders to identify and address any areas of confusion, bottlenecks, and so on, to ensure a kind of fine-tuning wherever possible. The export control question is a really, really important one. When it comes to eventual reconstruction of Gaza, not only will the definition of reconstruction and development and whether it's allowed or not will be absolutely vital, but export controls will come into play here, because things like heavy goods, machineries, complex hospital equipment, generators, and so on will be at the forefront. And unfortunately, we haven't seen the same pace of developments as we've seen at the US Treasury, for example, in OFAC with the creation of general licenses. There's no equivalent, and export controls in general in the US. So I think there's a lot of work that could be done there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now we've got some questions we haven't had time to answer, and some really excellent some really excellent questions too. What I would suggest for anyone who feels that they would like their questions answered if we haven't done it in enough detail, would you feel free via globalsanctions.co.uk to email the email address there? Or I'm sure the panelists who are all nodding don't mind if you manage to find their contact details online. If you can't, then please do ask me and I will provide them. The recording of this session will be available. We'll send it out on an alert on globalsanctions.co.uk. This and all the webinars also should be available on the webinar podcast section of the site. I just wanted to mention that we also on the site, I mean, we are trying to offer as comprehensive coverage of all sanctions laws, general licenses, commentary, case law, everything you can think of on the site. And we offer full free subscriptions to anyone in the charity and NGO sector and the academic sector. So please reach out if that sounds useful. It also occurs to me, I mean, we have now a dedicated section of the site for NGO charities and humanitarian action, where I hope we have gathered together all the relevant legal material. So do have a look at that, but very much welcome suggestions for other things that should be on there, because during the opening remarks, I was just thinking about the importance, as I think Luma and Erica talked about, of the various groupings and networks in this area, particularly the questions about the smaller charities and NGOs. So any information sharing that we can facilitate on tri-sector groups or other groupings, we'd be really happy to do that. So thank you very, very much to the panelists. It was absolutely excellent coverage of a complex area, and also to the audience for listening and asking so many interesting questions. So I will stop the webinar now and thank everyone again.